Well, it's been revealed the government tried to suppress information that could potentially embarrass them when it came to the High Court challenge on vaccine mandates for police and the New Zealand Defence Force. The government abandoned its appeal against the ruling that found the police and NZ Defence Force vaccine mandate was unlawful. They did so earlier this week, but you probably didn't even know about it. To discuss this now, I'm joined by lawyer Matthew Haig, who has been following this case and represents some of those who couldn't get their jobs. And good evening to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks for having me.
First of all, why do you think the government abandoned its appeal earlier this week?
We don't know why they abandoned their appeal. They didn't tell us. But what we say is that it never should have been made. The appeal prolonged the division and hurt caused by the government's unlawful vaccine mandate.
Could it be simply the fact that the government abandoned it, realising that it didn't have a strong enough argument to appeal this in the first place?
Yes, well, I think so. The government appealed on the grounds that the judge didn't consider what they call the precautionary principle, and that's an unusual ground of appeal because if you look at the judgment, there's 3 paragraphs which the judge dedicated to considering the precautionary principle.
Do you think the government made the appeal in the first place simply because it thought that if it didn't, it would look bad, thinking that, oh, well, the High Court's made this ruling against us, we're the bad guys, we'll just leave it? Do you feel that they had representation that said you must appeal this to maintain some sense of credibility?
I think the government are probably under a fair bit of pressure, not just from the public to maintain credibility, but also from the police and the Defence Force, who, in particular, in the case of the Defence Force, wanted to maintain their vaccine mandate, and an appeal before the Court of Appeal would have helped them to maintain that credibility.
You have information, and break this down for me, please, to suggest the government minister in this case didn't want some of this information coming out. What was that information, and what did they stand to gain from having some of the information suppressed?
Yes, well, during the High Court process, in particular after the judgment, the Crown, on behalf of Minister Wood, tried to suppress certain information. And that information was, there are several parts to it, but the thing that stood out to me was that in October, Minister Wood gave evidence that he had received advice from his public health experts that the mandate for police and the Defence Force was not required on public health grounds. Now, to me, that seems, first of all, unusual and also embarrassing for the government. They were told by their own experts that this mandate was not required on public health grounds, and it was, in my view, for that reason, unjustified.
So therefore, if that information was to come out in the public, Minister Michael Wood would probably look rather foolish.
I think so. I think it reflects badly on the government. They were told by their own experts that the mandate was not required on public health grounds, and yet they went ahead regardless and imposed it. And we're not talking about just a mandate. This would have resulted in the loss of hundreds of jobs amongst people who we need the most in our community. People in uniform in the police and the Defence Force who serve us and keep us safe would have lost their jobs. It was unjustified.
Essentially, you and your team, you won the High Court challenge that said that effectively the vaccine mandates for police and NZ Defence Force staff was unlawful. That's the High Court judge's words, not mine. But did they get their jobs back, and where are we at with this now?
So, yes, they did get the jobs back. We avoided them being fired, being discharged from the armed forces, which was a good result for the clients. Where we're at now, the police have made an effort to reintegrate the workers that were sidelined and suspended back into their organisation, and that's great. We're still working with the police. There is still work to be done. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the Defence Force. Very shortly after the High Court ruling, the Defence Force attempted to impose another vaccine mandate internally. We challenged that again by judicial review, and as a result of that, they withdrew that order. Really disappointing, though, that the Chief of Defence Force, in light of the High Court ruling, went ahead and tried to do the same thing that we'd already challenged. He withdrew it again in the face of another challenge. We're just waiting to see what he'll do next.
Maybe he's on a bit of a power trip, perhaps, because as we know now, the reason why we don't have to have vaccine passports shown at restaurants or anywhere we go now is because effectively, do they work? And the answer is questionable. What does this whole entire case for you, Matthew, show in terms of the government's competency or otherwise? Given what we know now, when we look back, do you think that the government, I mean, we essentially all of us were going by this thing day by day when it came to COVID-19, when it came to mandates. But do you think this has left a sour taste in the mouths of many people who once admired the government and the way it handled disasters?
Yes, the government has had more than 2 years now to think of a justified and lawful response to keep us all safe. And I think that we actually all want to support the government. This is an unprecedented situation. When it first happened, it was an emergency, and the government needed to act to keep us safe. But it has been disappointing that 2 years after the pandemic started, they haven't acted lawfully. They haven't taken the time and the care to not just keep us safe, but also keep our legal rights protected.
Now, I want to make it very clear in this interview, I did approach the press secretary of Michael Woods to comment on this. They haven't got back to me. I put a phone call in after an email. They said they would return my call in 5 minutes. They didn't. I don't know whether that's because they may be simply busy or whether the fact they don't have some answers. What I wanted to ask them is, why do they try to suppress some of the information in the first place? And what does this entire court process mean for the government and the way it's handling? They did not respond. So just finally, Matthew, in terms of this, I get the impression, though, this is far from over. What are you sensing now when it comes to the likes of the New Zealand Defence Force?
I don't know. I want to be optimistic. I want to say they're going to do the right thing and act in a justified and lawful way. Unfortunately, we've seen on several occasions this year that they have not. So what I would say to the Chief of Defence Force is act fairly, treat your people lawfully, do what is justified. If you don't, then we will resort to the courts again. But we actually don't want to do that. We just want the Chief of the Defence Force to act lawfully.
I wish you well. Matthew Haig, thanks so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Chris.